Some people are just always looking for a new project. Well, Carl Graham Fisher took that philosophy to the extreme. He started his first business at the age of 17 and from there went from massive project to massive project, consistently finding success in unexpected places through a combination of grit, ingenuity, and determination. He helped to start the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, to build the first interstate highways in America, and to build the city of Miami Beach. And yet, despite his considerable talents, his fortune would eventually be lost due to a series of unfortunate events. His name is not well known today, but by the people who do remember his accomplishments, he's generally considered to be a promotional genius, once described by the Indianapolis Star as the P.T. Barnum of the automobile age. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Carl Fisher was born in Greensburg, Indiana in 1874. His father, Albert, suffering from alcoholism, left the family when Carl was still a child, and his mother, Ida, struggled to support Carl and his brothers. He struggled in school thanks to a severe astigmatism and left school at age 12 to support the family. He held a series of jobs afterwards and showed a knack for promotion early on when he displayed a banner for the grocery store he worked at while sledding down a steep hill. He developed salesmanship selling candy, peanuts, books, and even shining shoes as a news butcher in Indianapolis. At 17, he and his brothers opened up a bicycle repair shop in Indianapolis, just in time for a bicycle boom. He was an excellent mechanic, but an even better rider, and he did stunts and competed in races across the region. He was already a master salesman. You couldn't be with him more than half a minute without feeling that life was a pretty damn exciting position, said one friend. Without an invitation, he walked into the office of one of the nation's top bicycle manufacturers and walked out with a dealership and 120 bicycles to sell on consignment. In the growing town of Indianapolis, Carl made his mark by showing a brilliant knack for promotion. He rode a 20-foot-tall bicycle down a crowded city street, strung a tightrope across the street and rode a bike across it, and even advertised that he was going to throw a bike off the tallest building in the city. And the police told him that if he'd try it, he'd be arrested, so he announced a time, and when the police waited for him to arrive, he threw the bike off at the appointed time. He'd spent the night on top of the building with the bike. His business thrived, but bigger things were already on the horizon. In 1898, he became one of the first people in Indianapolis to own an automobile when he imported a 2.5 horsepower motor tricycle. By 1900, his bicycle dealership had become an automobile dealership, one of the first in the country. To prove that automobiles were durable, he pushed one off a building and then got in it and drove it away. He was constantly coming up with new ideas, something he called a hen falling off, and then coming up with ways to turn those ideas into reality. And he still loved racing, only now he could go much faster. He toured the Midwest with some friends, billed as the Big Racing Four. He set a world record for 2 miles in just over 2 minutes in a race in Chicago. Astonishingly, he only got his first pair of glasses when he was 31. But this was a time before racetracks, and racing was dangerous. In one race, his brakes failed and his car plowed into the stands, killing and injuring 14 spectators. One of Carl's first safety innovations was to support Percy Avery's patented acetylene cylinders, which could provide light to cars, then far too dangerous to drive at night. He and some partners started a new company and called the invention the Presto Light. Though dangerous and explosive, their initial factory exploded and blew up the sauerkraut factory next door. The vehicle headlines became standard on nearly all cars. In 1913, Carl and his partners sold the company to Union Carbide for $9 million, nearly $250 million in 2020 dollars when adjusted for inflation. In 1908, he strapped a Stoddard Dayton car to a balloon. Some 5,000 people watched the balloon pick up the car with ease. He was to drive the car away after they landed, but to make it fly, he had had the vehicle's engine removed. His brother met him when they landed with an identical car, which was the one that he did drive away. It was simple, yet no one seemed to figure it out, Carl said. The publicity for the stunt went national, and he advertised that Stoddard Dayton was the first car to fly over Indianapolis. It should be your first car. On a personal note, flying over the city was the first time Jane Watts, soon to be his first wife, ever saw him. Like other car owners of the time, Carl was finding that cars weren't very reliable. Cars would often overheat or break down only miles off the showroom floors, and fixing them was just part of owning one. There ought to be a track to test these cars before the public gets them, he said. He'd also seen the greater reliability of European cars, and after watching a race in Europe in which only one American car even finished, and in last place, he became convinced that competitive racing improved the cars. There was no place in America to test cars over a continuous drive of more than 2 miles. It made up my mind then to build a speedway where cars could run 1,000 miles in a test, if necessary. To convince American automakers a track was necessary, he gave them a stark warning. European companies could take over the entire American market anytime they decide to export cars in sufficient quantity. You'll learn 10 times as much racing against each other as you will from listening to the complaints, he said, and advocated for a big new racetrack designed for automobiles. Within weeks, the Indianapolis Automobile Racing Association was formed. His idea was for a 3-mile track which banked curves that he had seen in England. When he found a good location near Indianapolis, he got a deal to buy it. He brought in his friend and business partner in Prestolite, Jim Allison, and then invited 3 others. Arthur Newby of the National Motor Vehicle Company, Frank Wheeler of the Wheeler-Shebler Carburetor Company, and Stoughton Fletcher, a banker. Fletcher dropped out because his bank thought a racetrack wasn't a good investment for his conservative reputation. Some of these conservative high society types called Fisher and Allison poor boys with big ideas. It was no matter. Allison and Fisher took up his shares and incorporated the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Company on February 9th, 1909. That summer they held balloon races before a crushed gravel track was even finished. The work crews worked 24 hours a day getting ready for motorcycle championships in August. The track was barely ready in time, but the motorcyclists didn't like the track, which developed potholes quickly. In the first car race a week later, 5 people died in accidents. Carl pivoted to buying 3 million bricks to make the track safe, giving the track its famous nickname, the Brickyard. Success was still mixed the next year, and the founders decided to hold just a single race a year, the International 500-mile sweepstakes race, and made the winning prize $20,000, making it the highest-paying sporting event in the world. It was a brilliant decision that almost immediately made the Indy 500 and the Brickyard the country's premier race and track. The first Indianapolis 500 was held on May 30th, 1911, with an estimated attendance of 85,000. While it was initially a good track for testing cars, racer Eddie Rickenbacker would say in 1946 that approximately 70% of all mechanical improvements originated on the Indianapolis Speedway. By the 1920s, most automakers had built their own proving grounds. Though he'd already made a name for himself, Carl was already working on a different project: roads. Most of America's roads were in rough shape, paved with loose gravel or completely unimproved. It made driving long distances difficult, if not impossible. Some city roads were paved, but driving was often considered a hobby and not a necessity. If you wanted to travel across the country, you took a train. Carl advocated that good roads are cheaper than poor ones, and that a little money spent wisely goes further than all the thousands thrown annually into mud holes. He told Jim Allison that the automobile industry should be willing to finance a road across the country. Think what it would do for the American automobile. He sold the road as a way to sell cars and set about convincing every automaker he could find to support the project. His biggest target was Henry Ford, the most dominant factor in the automobile industry of today. Unfortunately, Ford wasn't interested. As long as private interests are willing to build good roads, the general public will not be very interested in building good roads for itself, said the Ford Motor Company secretary-treasurer. Carl was still able to raise millions and settled on the name Lincoln Highway to honor the president. They began the Lincoln Highway Association to build a continuous improved highway from Atlantic to Pacific. The first section was completed in New Jersey and dedicated on December 13th, 1913. Fisher did everything he could to promote the highway. The association publicized high-profile contributions, such as those made by Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Edison, and current President Woodrow Wilson. They also publicized smaller donations, such as 14 cents from Native Alaskan children in Anvik, Alaska. Choosing the route would be the most difficult part. Well, it was easier in the east thanks to the density of roads. In the west, good roads were scarce. Putting together a team to scout the western route, Fisher rode at the head of the Trailblazer Tour that included 17 cars and 2 trucks, as well as the newspapermen from the Hearst Syndicate and telegraph operators to publicize the tour. The tour was greeted enthusiastically in every town, but the journey was arduous and it took a month to get to San Francisco. The final route differed from the one the tour had taken, to the chagrin of communities that had thought that they had been promised a stop on the highway. Dwight Eisenhower would follow much of the road on a difficult trip across the country in 1919, a journey which played a large role in his support of the interstate highway system during his presidency. Managing the many factors involved eventually made it clear that the automobile industry wouldn't be able to fund the road's construction. Ultimately, the association spent most of its money promoting the road, like building 1-mile-long seedling sections and lobbying every level of government to support the road. Ultimately, the Lincoln Highway was never truly improved along its whole length until the building and maintenance of roads was taken over by the government and highways were given numbers instead of names. Much of the Lincoln Highway would become U.S. Route 30. In 1910, Carl bought a mansion in Miami, Florida. Florida was sparsely populated at the time, though winter resorts had already sprung up. It was then that Carl first saw the mangrove swamp-covered peninsula across the bay that would become Miami Beach. Joining with other buddies, Carl saw in the island the makings of a resort, although his wife Jane disagreed. What on earth could Carl possibly see in such a place, she wondered as she struggled through the mangroves. It was enormous work clearing the marshy land, and it had to then be filled with sand that Carl and partners dredged from the bay. They intended to dredge up 6 million cubic yards of what looked like sloppy cream of wheat. They built acres and acres of land this way, and then planted grasses to hold it down. He built himself a house there, promised to develop golf courses, hotels, and more. At first, the investment struggled to make money, which was part of his inspiration for yet another tremendous project, a highway from Michigan to Miami. Roads in the South were particularly awful thanks to local resistance, and Carl and the Dixie Highway Association fought to convince Southern governments that better roads would bring tourism and wealth. The road came together even more slowly and unevenly than the Lincoln Highway, but did inspire many Southern communities to begin to work to improve the roads. Eventually, the Dixie Highway would bring millions to Florida. After World War I, the Miami Beach boom really began in earnest. He had spent almost everything he had promoting and building the place, and in the 1920s he earned it back. Carl managed a promotional boon when he managed to get President-elect Warren Harding to stop by his Flamingo Hotel. Carl was a major figure in the promotional image of Miami. In the middle of winter, he put up a big sign in New York City that said, "It's June in Miami." By the mid-1920s, he was wealthier than ever before. With the boom came land speculators, which tempered enthusiasm for the state and slowed the flood of tourists. Carl had already moved on to a new project, this time on Long Island, where he had purchased a new summer home. He discovered Montauk, a 10,000-acre piece of the island, which he intended to turn into another fabulous retreat. He imagined a resort city with the charm of the old world. Carl spent lavishly. On paper, he was fabulously wealthy, and his investments were all paying out. In 1925, he and Jane were divorced, and his mother died. Carl ironically started drinking when Prohibition began in 1920 and had suffered greatly when Carl and Jane's only child died, only 26 days old. He threw himself into Montauk, his Miami Beach at the north, and Jane remarried. Again, he faced criticism from friends. Why was he building a huge project if he didn't need more money? Just to see steam shovels throwing dirt and building things going up, Carl replied. And then, in 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane made landfall. It was the first serious hurricane in more than a decade to hit the area, and residents weren't prepared. The damage was bad, but the value of the land was hurt worse. Almost right after, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. This was the beginning of the end for crazy Carl Fisher. He tried to keep Montauk afloat and lasted a few years on receipts from his investments, but sales were lousy, and by 1932 Montauk was in receivership. A year later, foreclosures hit his properties all over, and much of his fortune was gone. He ended up selling most of the rest of his property off and living on a salary from his friends that kept him comfortable, though no longer wealthy. In his life, he refused to name any of his large projects after himself and went through a great deal of effort to stay out of the limelight. Though he loved publicity, he wasn't looking to immortalize his own name. His wife Jane later said that he made millions, but it was all incidental, and he would often say, "I just love to see the dirt fly." He's since been recognized by the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the Automobile Hall of Fame. But due to his drinking, by 1938 he was facing ill health and large doctor bills. He died of a gastric hemorrhage on July 15th, 1939. There's a memorial to him in Miami Beach with a bust that says, "He carved a great city out of a jungle." And of course he did more than that, from selling automobiles their first headlights to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway to his highways. Carl Graham Fisher left a lasting impression on the world as we know it. If you want to learn more about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, visit their museum. During the difficult years of the Depression, racing at the Indianapolis 500 was done by men who had the money to buy or build the cars themselves, and Umbrella Mike Boyle fit the bill. The notorious union leader, gangster associate, and race car enthusiast briefly upended the Indy 500 with ill-gotten money and a talented team. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Michael Joseph Boyle was born on June 11th, 1879 in rural Minnesota, one of 11 children born to an Irish immigrant family running a potato farm. By 1895, he joined the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers to learn the trade, and he qualified as an electrician in 1904 with the Chicago Tunnel Company. He joined the IBEW in Chicago, ultimately becoming the business manager of the Local 134 and a vice president in the union. Chicago at the time was home to some of the most powerful gangs in America, like Al Capone's, which would dominate the city in the 20s, and Roger Toohey's, an Irish gangster who started in bootlegging. Boyle was associated with a number of gangster personalities in both gangs, including Toohey himself and psychotic killer James "Fur" Sammons. Boyle was a powerful man in his own right. Unions and the mob were intricately linked in Chicago, but Boyle didn't need to call on the mob to send a message. One of his earliest headlines came in 1907, shortly before the National Electrical Exposition in Chicago's Coliseum. As Western Electric Company, union workers were installing new phone lines into the old building. Boyle ordered them to walk out. The exposition was in only a few days, and thousands of dollars of electrical work remained to be done. At first, the electrical company attempted to use their non-union workers to finish the job, but the pickets held fast, thrashing workers who tried to break the line. With the deadline looming, the company executives met with Boyle and acquiesced to an instant wage increase. The union workers finished the job on time, and Boyle made a name for himself. Illinois politics was controlled by thuggish and corrupt politicians like Mayor William Big Bill Thompson and famously corrupt Governor Len Small, and Boyle was knee-deep with all of them. Boyle's nickname supposedly came from how he collected tributes or donations from citizens and businesses looking for his support or just insurance against a strike. Boyle would enter a saloon and leave an open umbrella hanging from the end of the bar. By the end of the night, the umbrella would be full of money, and Boyle could simply close the umbrella up and go home. Years later, Boyle would dispute the story, saying he never remembered collecting money in an umbrella. Numerous other stories reported that he got the name because he carried an umbrella in rain or shine. Once he was asked how he managed to amass a massive fortune on a salary of just $35 a week. He answered, "It was a great thrift." By 1920, the Quad City Times reported that Umbrella Mike is conceded among union leaders to be the most powerful business agent in Chicago and dubbed him the Czar of Chicago labor. In addition to his supposed collection of donations, Boyle used his position to control almost every aspect of electrical work in Chicago and extorted money in a myriad of ways. He forced contractors to pay him to get work done, with one testifying that they paid him $500 to secure the installation of a circuit board. Another testified that Boyle had charged the church $200 as a penalty when they installed electrical equipment without his permission. Yet another said that he paid Boyle $20,000 as strike insurance. His work didn't come without suspicion. As early as 1909, he was indicted on charges of extortion. In 1915, he was indicted with a group of others for restraint of trade related to circuit boards. The nub of the case was that you wouldn't install even a union-made switchboard without Mike's approval. He was convicted for that despite an appeal, and the court called Boyle a blackmailer, a highwayman, a betrayer of labor, and a leech on commerce. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail, but with the help from his political connections, spent only 5 months there and received a presidential commutation from Woodrow Wilson in 1920, thanks to the intervention of the president of the American Federation of Labor. Boyle reportedly said as he left the prison that it was going to cost somebody something, and seemed to follow through with that threat when he called a massive strike in July, barely a month after getting free of prison. Hundreds of workers walked out of stations that controlled Chicago's streetcars just before work began and drove the whole city to a near standstill, forcing employees to walk to work. The strike was also blamed for the death of a 14-year-old girl and at least 20 injuries. Although he claimed that it was up to the companies to come to terms with the strikers, he was accused of ordering the strike simply to show he meant business and to prove that he remained dangerous. The strike ended a few days later. A few years later, Governor Len Small was indicted based on charges related to mishandling public funds. He was acquitted, but rumors swirled that the jury had been fixed. Boyle was called to testify about what he knew about the jury, but refused to talk. He was found in contempt of court and sentenced to 6 months in jail, but he decided to jump bail and fled the state. He was captured in September in Wisconsin, but after a mere 50 days in jail, released by Governor Small, who said Boyle's imprisonment was part of a conspiracy of my political enemies. Boyle shared in the danger of being a gangster in 1920 Chicago as well. His life was threatened on numerous occasions. He was at a strike where shooting broke out, killing an electrical union member and the leader of the ice cream truck union and wounding several others. In 1922, a man testified that he'd been ordered to hire a hitman to kill Boyle by the jealous president of another union. An electrical union member and rumored protege of Boyle's was taken for a ride and found dead. While becoming wealthy through graft and remaining resilient against repeated investigations and threats on his life, Boyle, like many wealthy men, had a hobby. While many of the gangsters of Chicago spent their money at horse tracks, Boyle spent his in Indianapolis, at the Brickyard, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, home of the Indy 500. According to Brock Yates, longtime editor of Car and Driver magazine and motorsport history writer, Boyle, at only 16, had seen one of the first car races in America in Chicago on November 28, 1895, and remained a fan at the many dirt road or wooden tracks used by early racers. Boyle began a racing team, buying cars and hiring drivers to race in the Indy 500. He brought aboard some incredible talent, like his chief engineer, Harry Cotton Henning, who Boyle made the general manager of the Boyle racing team, managing by far the most dominant team from the late 1920s through the mid-1940s. Henning had already been an Indy 500 crew chief in 1925. Boyle entered his first car in 1926, and his car took third place. Over the next 7 years, he entered 15 cars, but his best showing was only 7th place. And then in 1934, Wild Bill Cummings drove the Boyle Valve Special car to victory, taking a record prize. Boyle started a legitimate business to help with the racing team, the Boyle Valve Company, which manufactured high-priced valves for racing and passenger cars. He opened the Boyle Racing Team, operated a shop near the track in Indianapolis, which became a gathering point for insiders and got the name Henning's Hash House. While the Depression had hit car manufacturers as hard as anyone, for the wealthiest Americans there was still engineers and small race car manufacturers willing to build cars for the expensive and dangerous hobby. While American-built cars had their advantages, without support from the major passenger car manufacturers, their race cars were often behind their European counterparts. Adding to the quality of European cars was that European motor races tended to be run on regular roads and involved many turns and hills. American race car designers were simply designing for a different kind of race on oval tracks, always running counterclockwise, while Europeans usually ran clockwise. Additionally, during the Depression and the build-up to World War II, Nazi Germany poured an enormous amount of state money into designing race cars as a matter of propaganda, which allowed them to dominate racing in the interwar years to show off Germany's superior engineering. Some of the first Nazi-backed German racers in America raced in America in 1937, a race in which Boyle was present and entered a car. Boyle decided his best chance at winning the 500 would be to buy a European car, but that was no easy task. The Germans didn't sell their cars, and the next best were Italian, but he was flatly turned down by Alfa Romeo. The best option was determined to be a Maserati. Cars built by the Maserati brothers were perennially in financial trouble. Seeking to buy the best car they had available, they sought to buy one of 4 planned 8-cylinder cars currently being built. The Maseratis insisted it would be at least a year before the cars were finished, and Henning had to settle for buying a smaller 6-cylinder Maserati, possibly with the promise that it would be returned for credit on the larger car the following year. Wild Bill refused to drive the tiny car, however, and another driver rode in the top 10 until the car broke down after 165 laps. Hoping to secure the larger car, Henning traveled to Italy, where he was able to secure one of the 3 8CTFs, standing for 8-cylinder testa fixa, meaning fixed head. The car, chassis 3032, had been in one race where it got into a wreck. Its 2 sister cars fared poorly as well. One broke down mid-race and the other was disqualified after spectators helped restart it after it stalled. Henning approved, and Boyle bought the car for the princely sum of $15,000. Unfortunately, he would next need a driver. Bill Cummings had died in a car crash in a passenger vehicle in February 1939. The best choice was Wilbur Shaw, a driver born in poverty who had won the Indy 500 in 1937 and finished second in 1938, driving cars he owned both years. According to Shaw, he had become convinced he could win in a European car at the same race where the Germans first appeared, and Boyle had asked, "If I can get you one, will you drive it?" They struck a deal that Shaw would if he approved the car, and in the spring of '39 he found the new Maserati to his liking. Henning still had some headaches to resolve. The car shook on the turns, and he installed wooden stabilizers to cut down on it. He also found that the Maseratis hadn't emptied the coolant for the trip, and at some point the liquid had frozen and damaged the pair of fused 4-cylinder engines inside. In dramatic fashion, the Maserati brothers were able to send a replacement engine within 3 weeks. Possibly they hoped their reputation and fortunes would be saved if the car could win at Indianapolis. Emblazoned with a number 1 and an Irish pipe with a shamrock in it, they dubbed the car the Boyle Special. Shaw qualified second and won the race, although Floyd Roberts, the reigning champion, was killed mid-race in a crash. The Boyle Special was the first European-made car to compete seriously at the 500 since the 20s. Shaw drove the car the following year to a second consecutive win after leading for most of the race, although the last 50 laps were driven under caution thanks to rain. Though World War II loomed, Shaw and the Boyle Special planned again on winning the race in May of 1941 to become the first driver to win the race 3 consecutive times. On the morning of the race, a fire broke out that burned down a third of the Brickyard's wooden garages. The race was delayed, but the fire was put out, and only 1 car was destroyed. Shaw led for 107 laps, but on lap 152, one of the wheel hubs broke and sent his car out of control. The car was damaged and Shaw was badly injured, ending his racing career for good. Shaw later said that the faulty wheel had been marked with chalk before the race, but that the chalk apparently was washed off while the firemen sprayed the garages with water, leading it to be put on the car. Shaw would later play a key role in saving the Brickyard after the war. Though Boyle and Henning hoped to continue racing in 1942, World War II intervened. The car did appear again in 1946, where it qualified 7th with driver Ted Horn, who finished 3rd. Boyle, however, was done and sold the car that year, probably to Henning, who with new sponsors entered again. Horn took 3rd of the car in 47 and 4th in 48. Horn died in 1948 in a racing accident in another car, and Henning sold the car. Boyle had spent the 30s continuing to be distracted by continual legal problems in Chicago, as well as dealing with union business. In 1937, he had shut off 94,000 streetlights, along with traffic lights in the city's loop, as well as trapping 38 of the 55 bridges in the up position, causing enormous traffic problems. By cutting circuit break power, he was also able to cut the police phone line, paralyzing the city. "It's the city's funeral, not ours," Boyle said, and within 3 hours the dispute was settled. He tried again in 1941, somewhat less effectively, as police kept bridge controllers from raising the bridges. He was criticized in the press for holding one-man or whim strikes, such as a 7-year strike against a hotel that reportedly had prevented him from buying a nearby apartment, although he denied that was the reason. He was indicted again in 1940 for restraint of trade, a charge that was later dropped, and he was accused of holding up the installation of lights at a factory producing material for the war effort. He continued to serve with the IBEW until his death, participating in union politics. In 1946, he broke with his former ally, president of the IBEW Ed Brown, and played a leading role in getting Daniel Tracy, a former president of the union, back into the top seat. He also made a prominent but ineffectual call to reduce the work week to 30 hours. Despite his rough and sometimes violent past, Umbrella Mike died of heart problems peacefully in May 1958, at age 77, in Miami, surrounded by his second wife, 2 daughters, and 7 grandchildren. At probate, his entire estate was remarkably valued at only $19,000, leaving the location of his fortune a mystery. It is, of course, fair to criticize Mike Boyle for many of his activities, which were often patently corrupt and illegal and self-serving. But he certainly left his mark, and not just on Chicago, where Local 134 still exists. Through his patronage of motorsports, he created one of the most successful racing teams of his era. What Brock Yates called the single most successful car ever to run at Indianapolis, or perhaps anywhere in the history of motorsports. In 2019, Maserati, now owned by Fiat, celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Boyle Special's victory in 1939, saying the triumph brought Maserati huge international recognition and bestowed unique prestige on the company. Donald Davidson, the extraordinary retired historian at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, said that the Boyle Special was, without a doubt, the most successful race car in the history of the track. Whatever else he left behind, Umbrella Mike Boyle left his mark on the Brickyard. When Andy Granatelli died in 2013, he was eulogized in the New York Times and several sports periodicals as a colorful man who had left his mark on motorsports history. Involved with cars from a young age, the race that would dominate most of his attention was the so-called greatest spectacle in racing, the Indianapolis 500, where some of the most famous drivers ever to drive that track raced in his cars. On the way, he would make a name for himself both on and off the track, showing his flair for the dramatic, the persistent, and the ingenuitive. And all that was all the more impressive because he started with almost nothing. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Anthony Andy Granatelli was born March 18, 1923 in Dallas, Texas, but he grew up poor in Chicago. His mother died when he was 12, and he and his brothers would drop out of school at a young age to help support the family. He worked low-paying jobs at first, but by 20, he and his brothers Joe and Vince bought a gas station on the north side of Chicago that they dubbed Indy's Super Service, which provided gas and mechanic services. Indy's penchant for showmanship was obvious even then, as he turned his gas station into a production. Instead of just working on the cars, he envisioned a kind of a pit crew-style station where a whole crew of mechanics would work on the car at the same time.
The concept proved immediately popular and novel, as customers would wait in lines a block long to have a chance to watch their car being treated like a race car. At this time, he and his brothers became known for tinkering with engines and cars, and in 1945 started Grancore Automotive Specialist, Grancore standing for Granatelli Corporation. Soldiers coming back from the war were looking for things to do, and hot rod racing and hopping up their cars became a common hobby. According to Andy, they couldn't get the West Coast hot rod parts makers to sell them enough products. I told them, "You guys are missing the boat on all this. You should be making this stuff by the truckload." But none of them would do it, so I started making my own heads and intakes. Grancore parts would become famous in the industry, and they began selling these high-performance parts to retailers all over the Midwest. The brothers also started modifying existing equipment, such as flathead Ford engines, which they marketed locally as Grancore Fords. They installed the Cadillac overhead valve V8 into new 1949 Fords and called those Fordillacs, which they sold for $3,800. This may have been one of the ways that the Granatellis first entered the world of racing. Daytona Beach had become one of the most popular places in the world to beat land speed records. Many of the racers there had begun as whiskey transporters who ran moonshine during Prohibition and even after, and had been upgrading their cars to avoid authorities. Another reason Andy began promoting racing was simple business. He sold racing parts, and racers helped build a market for them. The Warriors were lean for racing. The Indianapolis Speedway was shut down. Many drivers were away serving in the military, and things like fuel oil and rubber were rationed. Interested in racing at a time when racing was difficult, Indy decided to found his own organization, and in 1947 founded the Hurricane Racing Association, which ran races at Soldiers Field in Chicago. He single-handedly created a series of hot rod and stock car races that raced across the Midwest in Illinois and Wisconsin, and attracted an all-time record crowd of 89,560 fans into Soldiers Field. He'd already become a wizard of promotion, advertising his first drag race at Half Day Speedway, which was originally Half Day Naval Outlying Field, used as an emergency landing strip for a nearby naval air station, as the first nationally advertised drag race. He brought in 26,000 race fans, when across the country at California, drag strips could only attract 1,500. In his autobiography, he also described the theatrics of some of these early races, which included drivers who were experts at surviving dramatic rollover crashes to the delight of spectators. He also drove a rocket car at state fairs and elsewhere, billing himself as Antonio the Great. In 1946, the Granatelli brothers purchased a Ford V8 Miller, originally built for the 1935 Indy 500, installed a new engine with a Grancore head, and drove it to Indianapolis from Chicago to be the first Grancore-sponsored car in the race. Driven by Danny Cladis, the car qualified 33rd and ran 46 laps before the car lost power immediately after a pit stop. The team towed the car through the infield and discovered that the fuel switch, which had been turned off during pit stops, hadn't been turned back on. The car was still race-ready, but officials determined that it had left the race course and was out of the race. They officially finished in 21st place. The Granatellis entered two cars in 1947 and finished 12th at 167 laps. According to Andy, he had squeezed out some extra laps through a little bit of trickery. The car was running low on oil, and the rule at the time was that no oil could be added, so Andy added water to the system to get a few more laps out of the car before it had to retire from the race. In 1948, Andy attempted to qualify for the race for his first and last time, wearing a helmet he borrowed from his friend Bill France, the founder of NASCAR. Andy himself would be vice chairman of NASCAR for a time. He crashed during qualifying and was seriously injured, even losing 11 teeth. Granatelli continued to enter cars in the following years. In 1950, Pat Flaherty qualified in a Granatelli car, and Andy convinced Clark Gable to pose with the crew in post-qualification photos. In 1952, a Granatelli car finished second, and another finished fourth in 1953. In 1952, Andy declared that we could have won this race, we could have won it, and someday we will win it. In 1954, the Grancore car was bumped from the race, and Andy decided that he was going to protest by no longer entering cars in the Indy 500. While he continued attending the race, he didn't enter cars again until 1961. The brothers sold Grancore in 1957, and in 1958, Andy and brother Joe brought Paxton Products, which was losing money developing superchargers. Within 7 months, the Granatellis had turned the business around, turning Andy into an in-demand player in the engineering and production industry. In 1961, Paxton Products was sold to Studebaker, and Andy became the vice president, chief of performance engineering, chief driver, and chief engineer at Studebaker. Working at Studebaker, his production cars would set more than 400 land speed and endurance records. Shortly before, Studebaker had also acquired a small company called STP, standing for Scientifically Treated Petroleum. Studebaker had briefly marketed STP as Studebaker tested products, but Studebaker President Sherwood Egbert tapped Granatelli as CEO of Chemical Compounds, which produced STP, thinking the product had a promise to become extremely profitable. And he would market it as the Racer's Edge. His leadership at STP coincided with a return to the Brickyard in Indianapolis. Before the 1961 racing season, Granatelli purchased the rights to the Novi engine. The Novi had first been used at the Brickyard in 1941 and proved to be an incredibly powerful but difficult-to-control engine. It had a characteristic scream that, thanks to a gear-driven centrifugal supercharger as well as an oversized valve design, gave it a louder, deeper roar. In 1948, Ralph Hepburn died driving a Novi, and racer Chet Miller died in practice driving a Novi in 1953. The engine was famous, or infamous, for being incredibly powerful, but dangerous. Andy brought his own ingenuity to the engine, developing a four-wheel drive version that was meant to better harness the engine's power. The last version used by Granatelli's STP Novi had an output of 837 brake horsepower. In 1961, the Novi looked like a legitimate threat, but its crankshaft broke, and so the car failed to qualify. In 1962, he brought two Novis, which again failed to qualify, but in 1963, Indy finally succeeded, when three of his Novis qualified. One was driven by then-rookie Bobby Unser, who would go on to win the Indianapolis 500 3 times. Unser was out of the race in lap 3 after crashing into a wall. The second car went out with clutch problems after 18 laps. Jim Hurtubise ran for a second time in the last Novi until he was forced to drop out thanks to an oil leak, taking 22nd place. All 3 cars qualified again in 1964, and 2 of them in 1965, but only in 1964 did one actually complete the race, coming in 11th. The Novis weren't the only thing he brought to Indianapolis in the 60s. What would prove to make Granatelli the most famous was his tireless promotion of STP. The cars that STP sponsored were STP Red, a brilliant orange-red color that would become famous in motorsports. And he starred in his own commercials, had his pit crew wear suits covered in STP logos, and even wore a logo-covered suit. His personality was part of the product, a callback, as Sports Illustrated said in 1968, to the days when peddlers sold their own celery tonic from Conestoga wagons. The STP logo became a phenomenon as he laid literally millions of STP stickers. In 1968, Sports Illustrated estimated that 28 million cars had an STP sticker, and he handed them out everywhere. The stickers became so ubiquitous on skateboards, cars, and clothing that some joked in 1969 that when the astronauts landed on the moon, they'd find an STP sticker already there. But whatever Andy Granatelli did, the Indy 500 called him, just like Melville's Moby Dick. In 1966, Andy joined forces with Lotus Cars Limited, a British car company, and finished second with driver Jim Clark. There remained some controversy over the possibility the lap was miscounted, as the second Lotus car looked nearly identical to Clark's. Clark returned in 67 with a similar car, but another STP entry was even more interesting. Driven by Parnelli Jones, Granatelli entered a four-wheel drive vehicle powered by a turbine engine originally built for helicopters, called the STP Paxton Turbo Car, which he also called the Whooshmobile or Silent Sam. Jones went on to dominate the race, leading for 171 laps. By lap 196, Jones was far ahead of the second place, and then he could quite literally see the finish line and his trophy. But then suddenly the turbine car lost power and rolled to a stop. A cheap bearing had failed, and Jones was out. In 1967, STP was a regular sponsor of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and Carson rode in the Parnelli turbine car during a segment that fall. Granatelli was a guest several times on the show as well, and aired his famous raincoat commercials at the Brickyard, showing off STP's lubrication qualities. In one famous commercial, Granatelli dipped a screwdriver in STP and asked Rocky Marciano, the undisputed world heavyweight boxing champion, to grip it with his thumb and forefinger, and it would always slip right out of his grasp. In 1968, Andy entered 11 cars in the race. Actually, some of these cars didn't even exist, but entering was cheap, and it meant that STP's name appeared all over the printed entry lists. 4 of the cars were wedge-shaped turbine cars built by Lotus. 3 qualified, and they took the first 2 positions. One of the turbine cars looked good throughout most of the race, leading its way up into lap 191, a stone's throw from victory. And for the second year in a row, a turbine car failed in the final stretch. After the race, new rules were implemented that didn't outright ban turbine cars, but effectively made them uncompetitive, despite Granatelli's protests. Granatelli's bad luck at the track was obvious. In 1969, he ran 3 new Lotus-designed cars. Mario Andretti drove one and crashed it during a qualifying, burying his face. Andretti would qualify instead in a backup car, the Bronner Hawk. The race was hard-fought, and Andretti had his share of close calls. On his final pit stop, his car nearly stalled, and he knocked over the chief mechanic. The car held on, taking first place. Andy Granatelli had a habit of kissing his drivers on the cheek, and the photo of Granatelli kissing Andretti has become an iconic photo of the Speedway.
Well, I tell you what, that kiss was actually welcome. I keep saying I still smell the garlic, but it was okay.
His wheeling and dealing brought him his fair share of detractors and admirers, but he didn't seem concerned about it. Continued to be lavish, outspoken, and visible. People say he's flamboyant, he's this, he's that, Granatelli said in 1969. That's just me. I can't help who I am. I was born supercharged. Another STP-sponsored car would win at Indy in 1973, and in 1972 he struck a deal with Richard Petty, the King, a NASCAR racer, becoming one of the first national sponsors of a NASCAR racing team. The deal had its own drama, as Andy wanted the car painted STP red, while Petty wanted to maintain the blue he had always raced with. The compromise included both colors. It became a famous color combination in its own right.
The STP sponsorship of Petty, and after he retired his racing team, is one of the longest-standing sponsor relationships in the history of NASCAR.
Despite ill luck at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Granatelli's work in business was more unqualifiably successful. He turned STP into a household name used by millions. Less than a decade transforming a company with $2 million in sales into one with $100 million in sales. The company was spun off in 1969, but majority shareholder Studebaker stepped away in 1973 after disagreements with STP's directors. In 1982, he drove a street-legal Camaro more than 241 miles an hour on a test track. I wanted the world to know that you are never too old to do something you want to do, he said. He left STP in the 70s as well, though he continued to attend the Indy 500, where his eternal and conspicuous presence earned him the title, Mr. 500.
Indy Granatelli passed away in December 2013 at the age of 90. It is believed that he attended every Indianapolis 500 from 1946 to 2012, although he had to miss 2013 due to ill health.
J. Douglas Bowles, president of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, said that Andy understood better than anyone the spirit and challenge of the Indianapolis 500. He leaves a legacy of historic moments that will live forever in Indianapolis 500 lore.
Andy Granatelli was inducted into 24 business and racing halls of fame for his many years of work in motorsports. And while he was famous for many things, after his death his son said of him that the thing that gave him the most gratification in life was what he did at the Indianapolis 500. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guide, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguide.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.
Pictures in Victory Lane. Are you giving Mario a great big smooch?
Right, why not?
I don't see anything wrong with it.
Here we are 33 years later, you're talking about it.
Yeah, but it's one of those things that you remember. Was that a spur of the moment thing?
Well, of course, I mean, well, he's Italian, I'm Italian. I was happy. Hell, it took me 21 years to win the race. Why not?